This month, our episode happens to be incredibly relevant to current island events. We are focusing on the story of the sperm whale stranding on Low Beach on December 30th, 1997, and how that whale's skeleton was then recovered to hang from the ceiling of the Nantucket Whaling Museum. Oddly enough, we had just finished recording this episode days before a male sperm whale of similar size washed ashore on November 16th, 2025. Thomas and Adam and I all had the chance to see that whale, and we stood on the beach with the wind and the cold blowing straight to the bone as we watched the Marine Mammal Alliance of Nantucket go into the water and anchor the whale.
The roughly 50-foot male weighs, get this, 104,000 pounds. It's unclear at this point how the whale died.
Watching the scene unfold, I think it's safe to say that we felt a unique appreciation for what we were watching, having spent so much time with the story of the stranding in the 90s. But it also gave us a new perspective on that story. Had we recorded this episode a week or two later than we did, that would certainly be reflected in our storytelling. Even so, we hope you enjoy hearing about the story of the sperm whale skeleton hanging at the Nantucket Whaling Museum as much as we enjoyed learning about it.
Welcome to the Nantucket Gam. I'm Thomas Parrish. I'm joined now by Annalie Gilbert-Keith.
Hi.
And Adam DeLogue.
Hello.
We are members of the Visitor Operations team here at the Nantucket Historical Association, and in each episode, one of us will go on a research blitz, pulling facts and stories out of the archives to explore the fascinating history of our island. Then, we will invite a guest to join our GAM to understand how the past continues to shape the modern history and future of the island. Today, we're going to dive into one of the centerpiece artifacts at the Nantucket Whaling Museum, the 46-foot sperm whale skeleton hanging in Gosnell Hall. Later in this episode, you'll be hearing from our colleagues, Niles and Jeremy, who were present at the stranding of this sperm whale and is going to tell us the story of how it eventually came to the Nantucket Whaling Museum. But let's start at the beginning. Annalie, what would it have felt like to see a sperm whale on the shores of Nantucket?
Well, it was a pretty big shock. Sperm whales were the whale species that was most prized in Nantucket's whaling industry. Those were the whales that Nantucketers were sailing across the world to find and bring back to Nantucket. So not only do you have this whale that isn't usually close to shore, stranding on the Nantucket beaches, it's also the whale that Nantucket's economy really was founded on in the 18th and 19th centuries.
There's sort of I'm not going to say beautiful, but there's sort of an irony of the fact that Nantucketers traveled the world for decades and decades, going to the far-flung corners of the globe, chasing the sperm whale. And in the 20th century, one of them washed up on our beaches.
It's pretty poetic.
I have to say that my only thought when hearing all of that is like the people who are engaging and having these emotions when this whale is stranded in 1997 are actually engaging with like a shared nostalgia for a history that they learned.
Right, like whaling is, if not the one of the most romanticized industries ever in American history, and Nantucket was the seat of that. And here you have an animal dying on your beach, right? And there's an emotive connection to this nostalgia of a day gone by.
Jeremy, in an article in the Inquirer and Mirror, phrased it really well. He said it's like watching Moby Dick in smell-o-vision, which I love because the number one thing that people talk about with this experience is how awful it was being on the beach and how smelly and dirty and greasy it was. But when you relate it to something like Moby Dick, that's this beautiful, epic, classic novel.
Romanticized.
Yeah, I think that really sums it up pretty well.
I mean, I think it's interesting because this episode is going to be a little bit different because all of us have heard stories of the whale washing ashore. Like, we've been here for years now, and I've all heard, anyone who is here has a story about the whale. And we weren't here when it washed ashore, but there's like very emotional connection to the fact that a sperm whale washed ashore, and this fact that, we saw this animal that Nantucket has hunted on our beaches, and now you can see its skeleton hanging in our museum. That's pretty cool. And unlike it's that lived history, we often talk about Nantucket history in the 19th century. This is Nantucket history, 30 years ago.
Sort of a New Year's miracle.
So we're getting ahead of ourselves. Yeah. Let's back up a little bit. There is a whale that washes ashore. Why does it wash ashore? Or where did it come from? Do we know that?
I don't know if we know where it came from, but
I don't know why I said that.
Away.
Did it have a passport on it?
From deep in the ocean.
An immigrant from France.
But it stranded 5 different times. And so the first time that there's a report of this, the call goes to the Nantucket Marine Mammal Stranding Team.
Who must have felt incredibly unprepared.
Right. They
normally
for
dealing with
situation.
seals.
Yeah, exactly. They mostly do seals,
maybe
dead whales,
the occasional dolphin,
Yeah. So yeah, it was really daunting. And then on top of that, part of why it stranded 5 times and they couldn't really do very much about it is because there was such intense surf and it was unsafe for them to go towards the whale, not only because it's unsafe to go near wild animals, but it was more unsafe for them to try to go in the water to save it. And that became a pretty big issue even after the whale died.
I mean, this is a multi-ton, for lack of a better word, blob that is run aground in the surf. And in the same way that trying to pull a ship one way or the other to get it out of the surf or even just get up close to it would be dangerous, I would imagine that this would be similar.
Did you mention where this was?
This was on Low Beach, so...
Okay, so the southeast part of the island. That is notorious for getting hit by waves.
Yeah.
And whales.
Well, not whales. He mentioned it ended up beaching 5 times. Mm-hmm. So it was it freeing itself and then coming back? Was the tide changing? What was happening?
As it's stranding, it's trying to save itself too. And so it's sort of coming in and out of the waves. And a lot of the injuries that it had when it washed up were abrasions and bruising from being battered in these waves.
And how long was this going on for?
It lasted about 24 hours. The first call reporting that this sperm whale was stranded came in December 30th, 1997, and the whale took its last breath around 11 a.m., December 31st of 1997.
I'm imagining that this whale on the South Shore has been called into the Marine Mammal Stranding Team. I'm imagining that this doesn't stay very private for very long.
No.
Especially because this is such an unusual situation. And I know they didn't have the Nantucket Current back then, so we wouldn't all have had Instagram updates. But does the word get out pretty quickly?
Absolutely. People were going out before the whale had died to see it because it was, it's the sperm whale that Nantucketers have this sort of nostalgia for, or nostalgic connection to. And hundreds and hundreds of people went out to Low Beach to see the sperm whale before it had even died. One of my favorite articles that I found measured the number of people that went based on how much the sales increased at the local photo shop.
From processing photos people had taken?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Sales increased by 50%.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty slow time of year. I figure most people... You could close the bait shop or you could close the,
December.
whatever else you're doing on island that day and go see a whale.
That was just my favorite thing that they measured it based on Photoshop
The increase
sales.
of photo sales? Yeah, it's awesome. That's so funny.
And the people that worked at the Photoshop didn't go see the whale, but they said they didn't feel like they had to at that point.
They certainly saw enough of the whale.
I will say we have some of those photos in our collection and some of them are gnarly.
I'm imagining that the marine mammals training team is not in charge of this situation for very long once the entire town starts showing up. So is there some sort of chain of command over the whale?
Great question.
Over what's going on here?
So there are a ton of groups that are involved. On December 30th, when the whale is first sighted, so before it's even died, the marine mammal stranding team called the New England Aquarium, because the marine mammal stranding team on Nantucket is essentially a satellite of a bigger organization.
Gotcha.
And so they call the New England Aquarium because also, as we touched on, they're not trained to deal with a sperm whale. And so they call scientists in. This is one of the first places that you see the way that this was a huge community effort. And the entire island really came together to keep this whale on Nantucket. As these scientists are coming over, the Jared Coffin House donated free stays at their hotel to the scientists. So you already start to see the island community supporting this effort.
It must have also been a governmental player because all whales, dead or alive, are protected at some level by the government, right?
Yes. So all whales are protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is federal law. But there are state offices that are able to respond more quickly than the federal government when a stranding happens. The New England Aquarium was working with the Office of Fisheries and Wildlife to get permission from the Massachusetts government to perform the necropsy on the whale. They got that permission within the day, so the aquarium scientists were able to be on Nantucket within 24 hours, and then one of their first goals was to determine the cause of death through the necropsy.
Did they find a cause of death? Because a whale washing ashore, much less a deep water whale like a sperm whale, when they wash ashore, it's typically because of abnormal health conditions, right? Like they were sick or injured or something?
It had an infection. They didn't know that until later. Within 24 hours of its death, they started a necropsy of the whale.
And what's a necropsy?
They're testing its tissues, they're cutting it open and really investigating to see why this whale died. And they found fluid in its lungs. So they
knew, pneumonia?
Yep. And they concluded eventually, and it took months for these results to come in, actually. But they concluded that it was from an infection that the whale had.
There's some pictures of this necropsy happening in our collection, and I have to say that some of them are pretty heartbreaking as they start cutting into this massive animal. You know, this beautiful creature in the water, but washed up, dead on the beach. Some of those photos are
graphic.
Very
graphic. Highly recommend anybody looking into it in our archives after listening to this to use caution.
Yeah, I mean, the one that comes to mind, just a little bit of a trigger warning here, is when they start cutting into it and the pressure on the intestines force them out. And so they're on top of the whale. It is disgusting.
The Inquirer described that moment. They said it sounded like somebody was tearing cloth.
Oh.
And then everything burst out because the whale's body held so much heat that it almost became like a little pressure cooker. And so everything just sort of exploded. Another thing that the Inquirer highlighted in the midst of this event was that, well, I guess it wasn't so much the Inquirer as environmental advocates writing into the Inquirer, because all of the cars going up to Low Beach actually did some pretty significant damage to the beach grass and the erosion there. And so there were some people that were really mad that so many people were going out to see this whale.
So the whale, how are they cutting into it?
Initially, they went in using modern tools like butcher knives, and they didn't work.
What do you mean they didn't work?
We were having trouble cutting through the whale skin and blubber and organs, and so ultimately, whaling tools were taken out of the Nantucket Historical Association collection to be used to dissect this whale.
I mean, there was a technology that was perfected for doing this hundreds of years ago. Why not? Well, 150 years ago.
And it still worked.
Wow.
Like a charm. At this point, this is still a whole community effort. We have volunteers that are working on taking the whale apart. There are onlookers, and there are also volunteers staying with the whale 24/7. They didn't want people to get too close to the whale. They didn't want people to go try to take the whale teeth, because those are incredibly valuable and illegal to have.
You don't want anybody to make off with your whale.
No. The Historical Association is very quickly involved. The two people from the NHA that were specifically most involved were Jeremy Slavitz and Rick Morecambe. And so you have them sitting with the whale in shifts until it's processed, but then you also have the processing of the whale happening. You also then have to be working to get the permission to keep the whale. Because when a whale washes up, it turns out a lot of people want the skeleton. There was a list of, I believe, 12 institutions that wanted this sperm whale skeleton.
Why?
To display.
So these are institutions like museums or zoos or what?
Yeah, I think mostly museums.
Okay.
And Nantucket was like not on the list of these institutions that were sort of waiting for a whale skeleton.
I bet those goobers over in New Bedford were.
And so it was a big deal that Nantucket wanted this skeleton and had to compete for it. Now, that actually ended up playing into the next steps once the island had permission to take this whale apart, for lack of better words. A lot of people who were then involved in that process had said that they would not help unless the whale stayed on Nantucket. And
So you mean a lot of Nantucketers would not help unless the whale stayed
correct.
here? Interesting.
That's par for the course, I feel like.
You gotta love Nantucket sometimes.
Yeah.
But so you've got so many different parts of the community doing different things all at the same time, right? People watching the whale, people studying the whale, trying to figure out what killed it, people cutting it up. Other people are already started on getting the legal side of things figured out. When do things start coming to a head? Like, when is this whale up and off of the beach, I guess?
Well, up and off of the beach doesn't happen for a little while. Initially, December 31st, the whale has been proclaimed dead, and they decide to try to move it up further onto the beach. And they bring out one excavator, and it couldn't budge the whale at all. And so then the next day, January 1st, 1998.
They bring out 2 excavators.
Well, 4.
Oh.
They got excited.
And actually, this is when the only moment that you see someone like get a little bit hurt was the fire department dive and rescue team member who was attaching the excavators to the whale's tail had to go into the surf, and the surf basically threw the whale's tail at him, and he sprained his ankle trying to get this whale chained to the excavators.
That's what we were saying before. It can be dangerous to have that much mass just
it hit his
around.
head a little bit too.
Man.
He was pretty disoriented. It was I think that would have been really scary.
Get slapped around by a whale's tail. First Nantucketer in decades for that to happen.
And then what do they do to process the whale?
So once they do get the whale out of the surf using excavators, they start essentially dissecting the whale like you would have if you were a whaler. So they start by taking the blubber off and piercing into the head case and getting the spermaceti oil, which there was so much of that they ran out of buckets to hold it in. And so they didn't know what to do. So someone grabbed a skiff, a little boat, and started collecting the oil in the skiff, and that filled up. And we still have a pretty good sized barrel of this whale's spermaceti oil in our collection space.
So they are draining the spermaceti from the head cavity, the case. They're using the NHA's historic whaling implements to cut off the blubber. what was that experience like for people doing it? Because in many ways, we at the NHA, we read about it all the time. We have documents specifically describing how to do it. But there's something very different about reading how to take apart a whale and then actually doing it.
Mm-hmm. Rick Morcom from the NHA said that for days afterwards, the volunteers who were helping, because it was all volunteers, complained of the pervasive odor. Everything tasted like it, smelled like it. They couldn't escape it. Jeremy spoke about how he would get home at night and leave his clothes outside because he just couldn't bear to bring them inside. And, you know, your entire body starts to hurt because you're using muscles that you would not usually use. And so I think it was a really intense, all-consuming, immersive thing to go through.
Now, what are they doing with, I mean, obviously they're barreling up this oil. Mm-hmm. What are they doing with the rest of the whale bits?
They were mostly trying to save the skeleton. So I think most of it was disposed of if it wasn't being sent off to a lab somewhere or studied in some other manner.
And how long does it take to process the whale?
The work to strip the whale bones continued through January 4th, 1998. So it took about 4 days.
And you mentioned the goal was to save the skeleton. And we talked previously about this effort to keep the skeleton on Nantucket. And we know, because the whale skeleton's in our museum today, that this whale skeleton did eventually stay on Nantucket, but that there was debate about where it was going. So what was the process that ultimately allowed the whale skeleton to stay on Nantucket and not go to one of those 12 institutions that you mentioned?
Well, a big part of how that happened was the fact that it was already here.
Save on transport costs? Yeah.
The skeleton itself is still a really heavy object, right? And so on top of that, the Toscana Corporation was pretty much the only place on Nantucket that had the equipment to move it, and they wouldn't move it otherwise. And then on top of that, it really is the community response of Nantucketers that proved that Nantucket was dedicated to this whale. You know, everybody came out. It was people coming to look at the whale. It was people on the stranding team. It was people from the NHA. It was organizations helping with equipment being used. You know, it was such a community effort. And I don't think that we can overstress that point. It wouldn't have stayed here without the strong Nantucket community.
Now, one of the fun facts about the New Bedford Whaling Museum, with whom we have a friendly rivalry, of course, is that one of their whale skeletons, the blue whale skeleton, one of 4 in the water on display, it's still dripping oil because the oil percolates into the porous bones. How did they clean the skeleton once they got it off the beach to try to keep it from continuously dripping oil?
I was really hoping you would ask this. So the first thing that they have to do is get all of the meat off of these bones. And so they can do part of that on the beach. They cut the blubber off, they get the organs apart. All of that happens at the beach. But then you still have these bones that are by no means clean of meat, blubber, etc. And the first thing that they do is bury them in a pit. And one of my favorite things looking back at old coverage of this, now we all know that it was Mike Lamb's pit. I think he may have already had the pit because everybody just refers to it as Mike Lamb's pit. Like it's like a well-known
around
thing.
For emergencies. Yeah. You never know when you're going to need an extra pit.
But for a long time, it was just the bones are buried in an undisclosed location. And it was just so cryptic.
Well, they had to protect Mike Lamb's pit.
Well, and the skeleton. So the bones in the manure pit at Mike Lamb's were really smelly to the point where more than anything else, they were bothering other people. And so they end up taking the bones out of the pit in May of 1998 and sinking them in crates in the harbor. That way little microorganisms and fish can eat the meat off the bones and save humans the work of cleaning them up. They stay there until November 3rd, 1998, and then the crates are taken out of the harbor.
Do we know where in the harbor? Was that also kept a secret?
It was kept a secret, but now we know it was off the Coast Guard station.
By Brant Point. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So all the ferries coming in would have passed right by the sunk whale skeleton.
Yep. And then when they come out of the harbor, November 3rd, 1998, the AP biology class at the Nantucket Public High School helped remove barnacles and little growths from the bones when they came out of the harbor, which is another fact I love. I love that it was like community involved at every step.
So the whale has washed ashore. It has passed away. It was dismembered on the beach. The bones were cleaned by being sunk in the harbor. When does the whale skeleton eventually go on display at the Whaling Museum?
It wasn't until 2005 that the whale skeleton is publicly displayed.
One of my favorite things about the museum is that the roof of the museum is actually shaped around the skeleton. If you look at our roof carefully, when you're visiting, you can see the curvature follows the spine of the whale as it dives down. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that space was intentionally designed around the whale skeleton, wasn't it?
It's true. It was. It's actually really interesting because the NHA had been trying to renovate and improve the Whaling Museum for years and hadn't had the funding. And at the time, there was a finback whale skeleton displayed.
That's right. I forgot about that skeleton.
That skeleton is now at the Nantucket Public High School. And that actually is part of the Historical Association's collection because it's pre-1972.
So is the sperm whale skeleton not part of our collection?
Correct. It's on permanent government loan.
I'm really happy we have it, actually. I think that we talk about whaling in such abstract terms. And so the fact that we can put the skeleton, the very same type of whale that was being hunted by the people we're talking about in our museum, it brings the story to life in a way that is pretty incredible.
I agree.
And moving.
I think one of the big challenges was that the skeleton is pretty much the only part that whalers didn't care about.
Yeah, you're right.
And so using a skeleton to try to illustrate all of the parts of the whale that are not still there was a really big challenge. And so that's where you also see the whale boat positioned beneath it to sort of try to bring these other parts of the story to life. And the renovated Whaling Museum didn't open until June 4th, 2005. But when it did, the opening party hosted everybody that helped. The Marine Mammal Stranding team from 1998, Toscana, and a fun little tidbit that I found in the Historic Nantucket article about it was that they celebrated with a keg of whale's tail beer from Cisco Brewers, which I love, just as like a little nod to the whale skeleton. And it was a really big deal for the community as a whole that now this whale skeleton is a centerpiece of this museum at the heart of town. And this experience that allowed them to have this new kind of connection with the history we're all so familiar with, that experience gets to live on through our exhibit at the Whaling Museum.
Thanks for joining us for today's story of how the whale made it to the ceiling of the Whaling Museum. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with Jeremy Slavitz and Niles Parker, our colleagues at the NHA who are deeply involved in this process.
Welcome back to the Nantucket Gam. Annalie and I are joined now by Jeremy Slavitz, who's our exhibits manager, and Niles Parker, our Gosnell Executive Director. Both of you were on island as this story unfolds, but you both have slightly different roles and experiences with the whale. Jeremy, you were on the beach, really in the thick of it, dealing with the whale as it washed ashore. And Niles, in many ways, you were exceedingly important in the integration of the whale skeleton into the current museum. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So just to start us off, what were your roles at the Historical Association throughout this story?
Sure. At that time, I was the public programs coordinator for the Nantucket Historical Association, and had been working here for a number of years.
And I was the chief curator. I came to the island after the whale had already beached itself, and as the bones were being lifted out of the harbor in the cages and being brought back to the storage facility.
Amazing. So when it comes to the whale itself, what did those roles translate to for you? How were you involved?
Well, I was actually involved right from the beginning. You know, I was basically sleeping in, and a friend came by and said, hey, you know, this word that a sperm whale is washed up on the beach. And I'm like, no, it didn't. The reason being, it seems like every time a whale washes up on the beach, you're like, oh my God, it's a sperm whale. So tells me the friend who told him, and this is somebody who knows what he's looking at. So we hop in the car and decide to drive down to Low Beach and see what's going on. By that time, a huge crowd had gathered up. The Toscana vehicles were already there, attempting to bring it out of the water. And as we're walking there, I'm like, speaking to my friend, I'm like, you know, we should see if we can try to get this for the museum. And he says, well, how do you do that? I said, I have no idea. And I said, but I've got some business cards. Walk back to the car, grab them out of the glove box. And I said, you know all the guys driving the heavy equipment. You know, let them know that we'll try to get it. And at that time, our structures manager, Rick Morcom, walked up, and he and my friend basically started working the crowd. And I went home and spent New Year's Day calling everybody I knew, friends in marine fisheries and things like that, and found out the process that this was not basically museums were in line should one of these things become available. And they're like, a number of other organizations have already submitted that, could we do this? And I said, okay, let's see what we can do. And by the time I returned, we had a verbal commitment from the state has a person who manages these large mammal strandings. We had a verbal commitment to be considered.
So this is at the same day that you arrive at the beach. So you have a verbal commitment the same day that you see the whale for the first time.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Then what ended up happening was we were told that the New England Aquarium was going to come in with their necropsy team. You know, they basically go and try to determine cause of death on the animal. And the guy tells me, you know, just be there, ready to help out. Don't get in the way. And, you know, but be ready and do that and be at the beach in the morning. So we rounded up a bunch of friends, all guys who had worked on the water together, and decided, okay, we'll have our team of like 5 guys, and we said, look, don't butt in, let them do their thing, and we'll go. And then it was like we then had, and Niles' curator hat is going to be a little upset here.
This is one of the best parts of the story. Yeah.
We're like, well, we need to cut up a whale. What does one use to cut up a whale? Well, right tool for the job. We had keys to the museum, we had a screwdriver, and we grabbed a bunch of the tools and brought those down to the beach.
Okay, it worked for 200 years. Why wouldn't it work today?
Well, they're technically museum objects.
Yeah. So who was you weren't curator yet, Niles?
No.
Who was curator at the time?
The curator was Mike Jaley.
And he was okay with this?
No.
Okay.
He was not on island. One of the reasons this sort of fell to myself and Rick Morcom was that Gene Weber, our executive director, was off island, as was Mike Jaley. So basically the top people in the organization were not there. So we're totally flying blind. And it's like, you know, am I making a commitment for the organization? But it was an opportunity that you really didn't want to pass up.
Did you work at all with the marine mammal stranding team?
The gentleman's name was Tom French, who was sort of guiding us on this. He's the state guy who deals with this. And we basically waited around, and then they began the necropsy, which was basically they had barricaded the whale off. The scientists from New England Aquarium then began to open up the whale.
So can you describe what you saw when you first arrived?
it was really cool. And the reaction of seeing it was really kind of neat. I didn't see it for very long on that first day because I was on the phone. Where I really got a good look at it was when we were babysitting it at night.
Oh, I was going to ask about this.
And why were you babysitting it?
The ivory in the lower jaw is very valuable. It had a black market value. And one of the typical processes they go through is they will take a chainsaw and remove the lower jaw with all the teeth. And we're like, well, we want this in a museum. We don't want to have to do that. And they're like, what if we babysit it all night? And so during this entire process, as we were harvesting the whale and stripping the bones out, we would then do shifts throughout. That same team would be doing shifts throughout the night.
How many people would be on shift at a time?
It was usually 2 guys, doing like sort of, an early to, somebody would stay as it was getting dark, and guys would go home, get cleaned up, get warmed up, and then come and then go till like midnight. And then another 2 would come in and do that. And that was really neat because we were sort of with this thing by ourselves and, being able to get up close and see this, before anything had been harvested out of it. Of course, we went, had to feel, what does it feel like? And do that. And, out there under the headlights of the truck, because it's pitch black at 4 o'clock, and you could see like where the scars were from, the squid's tentacles. And that was really neat.
Well, speaking of getting up close and personal with the whale, I want to jump back to these tools that were being used.
Yes.
So you go to the museum, you grab these whaling implements, and you return back to the whale.
The next day.
The next day, okay. And why did you grab the whaling implements as opposed to like fishing knives and more common, not historic objects?
We did bring those as well. But you're sitting there and, if we show up with like a 8-inch fillet knife, a 40-foot animal, it's that sort of thing. And with the tools, it was really interesting because New England Aquarium brought European flensing tools, which were 20th century. These tools that looked basically like a field hockey stick. And those are the ones that would be used on factory whale ships to the present day. And, so we also get to do sort of neat little comparison side by side.
Something that stood out to me, I was reading through old historic Nantucket and Inquirer and Mirror articles about this, and something that I hadn't thought of was that normally on whale ships, when whalers were processing whales, the whale's in the water and you can manipulate the body more easily, but you were on the beach. What kinds of challenges did that present, and how did you even sort of comprehend them as someone who hasn't gone whaling?
Okay. We had a pretty good idea of how one takes the blubber off a whale. And what we were really fortunate, and this is really something that can't be overstated, just how much like members of the community stepped up. The Toscana Corporation, they gave us an excavator and an operator for the entire time. And we were like, okay, well, we can't roll the whale over. It's just too big. So instead, what we did is, okay, well, to do this, we need a blubber hook. So we used the front end of the bucket on the excavator and a chain. And instead of, we made an incision down as close to the sand as we could and peeled it back a little, put a hole in it, ran the chain through it, and then just use that to peel the blubber as we're using those spades to get the blubber. And then we get to that side and then cut it off. And then the big, basically a blanket piece of blubber goes off to the pile. And we didn't take the blubber off the other side. We just sort of dug down through the whale until we got to the blubber on the bottom.
It's interesting to hear you describe it because I've spent many an hour reading whaling logs, and what you're describing is more or less the exact same description that whalers use to describe the process of taking apart a whale. Were you basing this off of historic records, or how did you know even to start the blubber process versus the meat?
I had been at the NHA for years. I've been lecturing at the Whaling Museum. A variation of the same lecture that you guys do, I'd been doing for years, and I'd done the research on it. And, knew how this is generally how it's done, and let's kind of make it up from there.
Did it feel like that translated well, or was it sort of awkward putting that into practice?
We were really fortunate in the group of volunteers that were doing this, in that we all had grown up on the water, and we had all worked on charter boats. I started working on charter boats when I was 14 years old. I captain's license, was running charters by the time I was 18. And all these other guys were basically in that same group. And, some guys were older, but we had all worked with one another. We had all fished on each other's boats. So we were able to have a really cohesive team of guys who were able to work with one another. And, you'd say, well, I described, like, this is what we're going to do. And we're like, well, let's use the excavator as a blubber hook. And we had a really great team involved with that. Mm. And then because we had to go from we weren't harvesting blubber. We were trying to harvest bones. Mm. And then that next sort of problem solving stage, like, for example, how do you preserve very small bones from a very big animal? And as you're doing this, the beach is just a mess. Just the sand is red, there's gurry and bits of meat around. And for example, if you look at the pectoral fins on the whale, where you have the bones that look very much like your hand, the bones in your hand, mm-hmm. Some of those bones in that are only about the size of your thumbnail. So it's like, oh, we don't want to lose these. So what we did is like, okay, why don't we just take it off at the shoulder? Hmm. So we went and, undid the ball and socket joint at the shoulder. And then, okay, well, how do we then know where the bones go? We were able to go, and we knew the radiologist at the hospital. We wrapped the entire thing in plastic. We brought it to the hospital at night and did a whole x-ray of the thing, which later on, in this case, to get the bones out, what we did is we basically buried it in horse manure. Mm-hmm. And every couple of days we'd go and like scrape the tissue away. And then...
I'm just going to cut you off. Was this part of your job description when you were hired for public programming? Is it you were scraping tissue off of horse manure covered sperm whale fins?
Yeah. Yeah, this was a neat experience in that regard. But what we did is we took those x-rays and we built a light table in the wood shop and laid the x-rays down. So as a bone came out, it then got put on the x-ray.
That's super cool. What was the most surprising part about the experience to you?
How you can't get the smell off of you. It took us like 3.5, 4 days to basically be off the beach. And you just were not clean at all. And you were basically getting undressed outside the house and, getting like a bathrobe on and going and showering up, and it just clings to you. And so we did this, and then we had we got everything done, and then we had sort of the weekend, and I come in Monday and people are like, you gotta go home. We can't have you in the office.
I mean, there's the classic, note, but that you could smell a whale ship a mile away. And you can only imagine doing that for years on end with that whale oil percolating into the wood of the whale ship, that you can imagine the stench that it would have had.
It was pretty disgusting. Where when the whale was sort of whole, it didn't seem to smell all that bad. And of course, there was this big, massive crowd around watching the New England Aquarium folks. When they started opening up, they were basically opening up the abdomen. The gases that built up from decomposition, basically the intestines spurted out like a party favor. And then the smell hit. And then all of a sudden, this massive crowd was down to the guys that are like, hi, we're here to help. And folks did come and go, but that sort of just sticks to you and did not go away. I mean, everybody just basically started wearing the same stuff every day. And when it was done, that stuff just went to the dump.
Do you have moments still where you smell that again, where it comes back to you?
Yeah, like for example, when my chest freezer broke last summer, and I didn't find out for 2 weeks. Yeah, you have that smell. And was it a couple months ago, we were moving some of the original pieces of the beam press. And that smell triggered it.
I want to jump over to you now, Niles, because in many ways you were saved from the stench, you being off island, but you come back when the whale skeleton's coming out of the water, it's still in cages. Was this, passion for keeping the whale skeleton on Nantucket still tangible when you came to Nantucket?
Definitely. Yeah. It's funny. I wish I had been part of that. At least I say I wish I had been part of the.
It'd be a pretty cool experience. A once in a lifetime.
I may have bailed upon the smell. I don't know. But yeah, it was absolutely a core part of what I was hearing and seeing when I arrived for interviews for the job. I remember touring through all the different properties and then going out to the storage facility, and they had said that you're going to see the bones that have just come back.
That's the first time I met you.
Was there.
Yep.
Yeah. And it was a pile of bones. I mean, it really was. And the vision, though, and the passion for it was really clear. That this, as we've talked about, this was a sperm whale, and we knew that was going to be the centerpiece of the new exhibit building that had been discussed. There was no plan for it yet. There was no design, but we knew that was going to be the centerpiece of it.
So the NHA had already been confirmed as the final resting place for the skeleton when you arrived.
Yeah, I think that had just happened officially. I think in fact, I don't even think the final paperwork had arrived yet. I think we got that a little bit later, but it had been approved.
It had been sort of verbally approved a couple months later. That we couldn't have soaked it
right
until we had the approval.
Right.
Was it intimidating coming in as curator at the front end of this project that led to a major renovation of the Whaling Museum?
I think it was incredibly exciting. And having the whale and knowing that was going to be a centerpiece in some ways made it easier because you weren't starting from a blank canvas and scratch. You knew that here you had this thing, this massive 48-foot long skeleton that was going to be a really dynamic, exciting part of whatever that space was going to look like. So that kind of helped. And from the minute I was hearing people talk about it and the passion for the vision, I was hooked. What a cool opportunity to be a part of that and get a chance to design something and build something with this creature that, kind of gave itself to Nantucket on New Year's Day.
Something that really struck me when I was reading about this entire process, and something that you alluded to, Jeremy, is that this whale wasn't harvested for blubber like most sperm whales hunted by Nantucket whalers were. And the bones really represent every part of the whale that isn't still there. How did you tackle that as a curator, thinking about how to make the bones speak about all of these other things?
So that was probably one of the hardest parts of the job when we were designing what it was going to look like, because the bones only show so much. And in the case of the sperm whale, obviously you're missing the big part of the head case where the spermaceti was, which was maybe one of the most important parts of the whale. How do you show that? And we went back and forth for months on that. Do we have an outline in steel going around the skeleton? Do you project something? Do you have something on the wall behind it? And we never really came up with a great answer on that one, I felt. And we ended up just saying, well, just let it be the bones, let it be the skeleton. And there was something kind of poetic about that, I thought, at the time. And we went and visited several other museums to look at skeletons and see how they were mounted. So we went to the Museum of Natural History in New York and New Bedford. And I think there's one up at Exeter, Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire, maybe. I think they had one that we saw and others. But, in many of them, they're just sort of displayed fairly flat.
At the time, the NHA had the finback whale that was displayed that way.
We had the finback whale that was in that shed where the new building was eventually built. That's now at the high school. And you're right, it was exactly like that, just sort of straight ahead, didn't have much dynamism in its positioning. And we knew right away we wanted to not do that. We wanted to put some life into it, if you will. That inspired us from the get-go. And then it was a question of how are we, exactly where does that go? What does it look like? And how do you tell that story? And, you read Moby Dick and, the chapters and the parts where Melville's talking about all the different names for whales. And there's so much there that you're like, we could have done so much with projections, as I say, or labels or other things. And at the end, we just decided that spare was better.
One of my favorite design features is that it's not just on the roof, in sight, but out of touch. It is with the jaw coming down. When you walk into Gosnell Hall, you are in the jaws of the sperm whale. It's almost within arm's reach, but please don't touch it. But it is almost within arm's reach. And this is only a juvenile whale. One of the things I'm always taken by when I'm doing my lectures or presentations is Nantucketers are traveling the world hunting animals, this animal, but that can be significantly bigger. That can be up to like 30 feet bigger, in fact. And so the scale that people are so taken by often in the museum, that's just a teenager. And I think that it really is a powerful piece to the history of whaling. And there's something poetic about the fact that we have the skeleton of a whale that came to Nantucket after Nantucketers spent generations going to them halfway around the world.
Nicely said. Yeah. And I'm glad you raised the point about how it's looking you in the face. That was very deliberate. And working with the architect and the design, we knew we wanted to, as you rounded that corner and came into Gosnell Hall, we wanted it to be staring you right in the face and to be approaching it at eye level, more or less.
What was the makeup of the team to get the whale into Gosnell Hall? Because you have to have, architects, the person articulating the skeleton, curation team, and designers, how many people had to be involved in that?
Yeah. I'll answer that in two parts. The second one, Jeremy, I'm sure remembers, and we'll have fun talking about that, I think. But so we were working with the architect from the beginning, which was really important, again, because we knew we wanted to have this massive skeleton in the middle of the museum. He was able to design the building around that. So you see that ceiling with that sort of the swoop to it. That was intentional to allow for the shape of the whale. And then they were able to install mounts as part of the building fabric that we could secure the skeleton to along the way. So that sort of the curves and the shapes and the materials of that space were thought out ahead of time with the architect and the exhibit designers, and the Dan Dendanto was his name, who was the mount maker, the articulator from Maine, who was involved from the beginning as well. So that was, I think, a really good decision we made to have everybody around the same table thinking about the design collectively. That paid off. The exhibit design firm, Amaze Design, helped us sort of think through and iterate on the diving, the shape, what else is going in that space, what are the stories we're telling there. And then Dan Dendanto, and this is what he does, he articulates skeletons. And we did quite a bit of research trying to find who that right person might be to work with us on it. And Dan stood out. And working with Dan on it was really eye-opening, and learning about sort of where the bones go, and taking advantage of some of the work that Jeremy mentioned that they had done earlier about sort of cataloging the bones and making sure where they came from, putting the bones on the slide table and making sure we had everything. And so it really was a collective team effort. And then Dan came down and took all of the bones with him in a trailer on the back of his truck on the ferry, drove it up to, he lives just outside of Acadia National Park on Mount Desert Island. And I remember thinking as he was loading up the entire whale onto his truck and driving away in the ferry, I was like, what are we doing? We're letting this guy drive the entire centerpiece of the museum away. And we went up a couple of times to visit him and check on the progress and see what was going on. But then part two, that's what I was saying, is when he brought it back. He brought it back in parts, but the vertebrae was sort of already strung together like a bracelet. And he had said again and again, I've taken really specific measurements on the dimensions of the front door, because that was the only way it was going to get into the building. And I remember there was a team of us who were probably, you weren't there on that one?
No, I wasn't.
Brought it off the truck? Oh, man.
There are great pictures from that.
So it was Jeff Pollock, I remember, maybe Ed Boynton, a few other people. We got it off the trailer. We're going right off of Main Street Broad Street into the front door of the museum. And the clearance must have been a couple of centimeters. I was sure that we were in serious trouble, that it wasn't going to fit into the door. We were going to have to break apart the frame, and it worked. You got it in. And then getting the skull in was certainly really heavy and a challenge. It was a team effort, to be sure, from the design to physically bringing it into the front door of the museum.
By the time the museum reopened, which was 20 years ago this year, was the community enthusiasm still really a key part of opening the doors to see the skeleton? Or was it just excitement that the Whaling Museum was reopening? Like, what was that like?
I think a little bit of both. It was exciting for sure. But there were definitely people who wanted to see that skeleton again and see it in place and see it hung in this new building. That was a key part of that.
What's it like for both of you today, walking by the whale skeleton almost daily at work with these memories?
It's kind of neat to be able to look up and say, that thing looks really cool, and I was part of that. And you're reminded of the experiences that came out of this and stuff that, you never expected you were going to be able to do. That you did get to do that. It's fun on sort of a storytelling level. It's also fun to have been able to do all of the other parts of that. And, for me, it's remembering the process that we went through, from the time we removed it from the beach to the time we ended up until we could get the basically crates that we submerged in, we buried the whale. And then, remembering going and, fetching those things out of a gravel pit and getting them, and how do we build one of these crates? And even like when the process was done, we acquired some spermaceti out of that process. And, a couple months later, going and setting up a makeshift Tri-Works behind our support building and processing the spermaceti, which that one the neighbors didn't like. The neighbor came over and was like, "What is that smell?" And then, what? and it's just billows of this white smoke. And but what's crazy is once he found out what we were doing, he's like, "Oh, can I help?" And we literally were using like a kid's shovel to like keep loading solid spermaceti to bring it back to liquid and separate that out. It's a really great experience.
So I would say that I often think back to seeing those piles of bones when I met Jeremy out there in the Annex building and think of what that looked like and the challenge that we had in front of us. And I still think back to, should we have done a steel outline around the whale? Could we have done this slightly differently? But all in all, I still have that feeling when you come around down by the timeline and turn the corner to go in there and you face the whale head on, and it still moves me. It still feels really good and is exciting to me. So it's held up well, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, thank you both for joining us. It's not every day that I get to talk with someone who has processed a whale. I read about it almost every day, but having someone with hands-on experience of how that process is done and hearing about it is fascinating. So thank you both for the work. I think the whale is one of my favorite pieces of our museum. So thank you both for your contribution to make that happen. And thank you for joining us on the Nantucket Gam.
Thank you.
For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalie Gilbert-Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. Thanks for listening.